Hey guys, tonight we begin with a place that looked absolutely perfect from the curb and quietly fell apart behind the vertical blinds. 1990s American suburbia. Rows of nearly identical houses, lawns trimmed with the intensity of a military operation, and a smiling beige contentment that everyone agreed to perform whether they felt it or not. Hollywood sold you block parties and sprinkler rainbows, but underneath the fresh sod there was debt, boredom, casseroles of unknown origin, and neighbours who could clock a new car in your driveway from 3 houses away. Before you get too cosy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and a sincere thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas genuinely shape what we cover, so thank you for that. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. And if you find yourself wanting even more to drift off to, there is a membership option waiting whenever you are ready, with extended 8-hour versions of these journeys and no ads to pull you back awake, all tucked away for those long nights when sleep just will not come. No pressure at all, of course, only if it is something you would genuinely enjoy, and if you would rather listen with your eyes closed, we are now on Spotify too, with a link tucked away in the description. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But first, let's wonder about a few things. Have you ever wondered what was really going on behind all those matching front doors? Why every basement smelled faintly of damp and secrets? What exactly was suspended inside that green gelatin mould at the neighbourhood potluck? Could you survive a homeowners association meeting about the regulation height of your mailbox without losing your mind or your security deposit? Would you last a single afternoon as a latchkey kid, home alone with a rotary phone, 3 channels, and the growing certainty that a stranger was about to call? And could you keep smiling for the Christmas card while quietly drowning in a stack of credit card statements? Well, you are about to find out. Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1994, in a house that looks exactly like the one next door, which looks exactly like the one next to that. The coffee is brewing, the lawn needs mowing, and somewhere down the street, someone is already judging you. Welcome home. Let's start with your home, or at least what you think is your home, because honestly it could be any of the 40 other houses on the street. Same floor plan, same beige siding, same little decorative shutters that do not actually shut. You could stumble home half asleep, walk into the wrong front door, sit down at the wrong breakfast table, and get 3 bites into someone else's cereal before anyone noticed. Suburbia in the 90s was built fast, built cheap, and built to be identical, because nothing says the American dream quite like a dream everyone is having at the same time, in the same shade of eggshell. These were the fruits of the master plan subdivision, where a developer bought a few hundred acres of former farmland, bulldozed every tree with a name, and printed out houses like a photocopier that only knew 4 settings. There was the Aspen, the Windsor, the Cambridge, and the Sheffield, and the only real difference between them was whether the fake fireplace sat on the left wall or the right. You could tour a model home, admire the tasteful staged furniture and the bowl of decorative wooden apples, and then buy a house you had never actually seen because it did not exist yet. It was faith-based real estate. You signed for a foundation and a promise. And the construction. Oh, the construction. Walls so thin you could hear your neighbour sneeze, disagree with his wife, and microwave a burrito, all in sequence. The materials were chosen by a spreadsheet, not a craftsman. Particle board where wood used to be. Vinyl where anything sturdier would have cut into the margin. You hung a heavy picture, and the drywall simply gave up, crumbling into a little pile of regret on the carpet. The houses were designed to look permanent and behave like a stage set, which, spiritually speaking, is exactly what they were. Let's talk about the colour palette, because someone clearly decided that joy was a fire hazard. Everything was beige, taupe, greige, or a daring splash of almond. The carpet was beige, the walls were beige. The refrigerator, in a bold artistic statement, was almond. The theory was that neutral tones appealed to future buyers, so you spent your entire life inside a colour chosen specifically to please a stranger who did not yet exist. Your home was not decorated for you. It was staged for its own resale, like a hotel room that you happened to be paying a mortgage on. The strangest part was how quickly you stopped noticing. Within a month, the identical houses felt normal. You navigated by the one blue mailbox and the house that inexplicably had a boat in the driveway. You gave visitors directions like turn at the cul-de-sac that looks like the other cul-de-sac. No, the third one. Delivery drivers wept openly. Pizza arrived cold and confused, having visited 4 wrong porches first. The uniformity that was supposed to feel orderly instead produced a low, constant, dreamlike disorientation. The sense that you had wandered into a photograph of a neighbourhood rather than an actual one. And yet you bought it, literally and emotionally, because sameness was the entire pitch. Nobody's house was too big or too strange or too much. Everyone had roughly the same square footage of quiet dissatisfaction. Conformity was not a bug. It was the amenity you paid extra for. You wanted to belong, and belonging in the 90s suburb meant becoming architecturally indistinguishable from the people you would spend the next 20 years politely avoiding. You had achieved the dream. The dream, it turned out, had a 2-car garage and absolutely no idea who you were. Step outside and behold your true master, the lawn. Not a garden, not a meadow, just a flat green rectangle that demanded more attention than most marriages. You watered it, you fed it, you edged it with the seriousness of a surgeon, and you did all of this so that a man named Gary 2 doors down could not smugly outgreen you. A single dandelion was a moral failing. A brown patch was a scandal whispered about at the mailbox. And the chemicals you sprayed to keep it that unnatural emerald shade, best not to think about those while the kids rolled around in it barefoot. Understand that the lawn served no purpose. You did not graze animals on it. You did not grow food in it. You did not, in any meaningful sense, use it. It existed to be looked at and, more importantly, to be judged. It was a giant green report card laid flat in front of your house, graded daily by everyone who drove past. And the American obsession with it ran deep, a strange inheritance from grand English estates, adopted wholesale by people whose entire property was slightly smaller than the estate's herb garden. You were performing aristocracy on a 1/4 acre, and it was expensive. The tools alone could bankrupt a small nation. The mower, of course, but also the edger, the trimmer, the aerator, the spreader, the leaf blower loud enough to summon weather. Saturday morning became a symphony of 2-stroke engines, every man on the block emerging at 8 a.m. sharp to establish dominance through noise and diesel fumes. You did not sleep in on Saturdays. Saturday belonged to the grass, and if you tried to rest, the sound of Gary's mower would drift through the window like a taunt, a mechanical reminder that somewhere, someone was winning at yard and it was not you. Then came the watering, that great suburban ritual of pouring drinkable water onto ornamental plants during a drought while the news politely asked everyone to conserve. Sprinklers ticked to life at dawn across the entire subdivision, a coordinated act of gentle municipal defiance. Some households installed automatic systems on timers, which meant the sprinklers dutifully ran during rainstorms, watering the lawn while the sky also watered the lawn, 2 forces of nature and technology teaming up to drown a rectangle of grass that never asked for any of this. And the chemicals, let's return to those, because they were the dark heart of the perfect lawn. To achieve that impossible, uniform radioactive green, you doused the yard in fertilizers herbicides, and pesticides, with names that sounded like villains from a science fiction film. Then you posted a tiny flag warning that the lawn was for the moment mildly toxic, and then you let the dog out onto it. The same lawn the toddler face-planted into, the same lawn where you spread the picnic blanket. You were cultivating a beautiful poisonous carpet and living your happiest outdoor moments directly on top of it. The real cruelty was that the lawn could never be finished. It was not a project with an ending. It was a life sentence with weekly check-ins. The moment you mowed, it began growing back, mocking you, plotting. You would spend decades of Saturdays, hundreds of gallons of gas, and untold sums of money maintaining a thing whose only reward was that, briefly on a good week, nobody had anything to say about it. That was the prize. Not praise, just the temporary absence of judgment. In the suburbs that passed for victory, and you mowed on toward the horizon like a man rowing a boat he was not allowed to dock. Now, let's talk about the people who technically owned your soul, the Homeowners Association. On paper, it existed to protect property values. In practice, it was a small volunteer government run by whoever had the most free time and the least joy. They had opinions about your fence, your paint, your basketball hoop, and the exact number of days your trash cans could linger at the curb. Cross them, and you got a letter. A polite laser-printed letter that somehow felt more threatening than any medieval executioner. Because in the suburbs, the guillotine was a fine, and it came with a friendly newsletter. The genius of the HOA was that you agreed to it. Somewhere in the mountain of paperwork you signed at closing, buried between the mortgage and your own dignity, was a document surrendering your rights to a committee. You could not paint your door a colour that had not been pre-approved from an official palette of 11 acceptable shades, all of which were technically brown. You could not plant the wrong shrub. You could not leave your holiday lights up past a date determined by people who took holiday light removal deadlines extremely seriously. And every neighbourhood had one, the enforcer, the resident who patrolled the streets not for crime but for infractions. This person owned a tape measure and was not afraid to use it, kneeling in your driveway to confirm that your grass exceeded the maximum permitted height by an outrageous half an inch. They knew the bylaws by heart. They quoted them at barbecues. They had at some point printed the bylaws out, laminated them, and possibly slept with them under the pillow. Their power was small, petty, and absolutely total within the borders of the subdivision. Attend a meeting and witness democracy at its most exhausted. In a stuffy clubhouse under fluorescent lights, grown adults debated for 2 hours whether mailboxes should be permitted in the shade of bronze or only in the shade of black. Tempers flared. Alliances formed. Someone brought a binder. Someone else stormed out. These were people who could not get worked up about anything larger than their own property line. So they poured the full force of their unspent human passion into the regulation of decorative flags and the moral question of the visible garden hose. The letters were the true weapon. They arrived without warning, addressed formally, citing your violation with cold bureaucratic precision. Your trash can had been visible from the street for 18 hours beyond the permitted window. Your fence had faded to a shade no longer within compliance. A basketball hoop had been detected. You had not committed a crime in any legal sense, but you had committed something worse, an aesthetic disruption, a crack in the uniform surface of the neighbourhood, and it would be corrected with escalating fines whether you liked it or not. And you could not simply ignore them, because the HOA had teeth, real ones. Unpaid fines could pile up, attach to your home, and in the most extreme cases threaten the very ownership of the house you were still paying for. A dispute over the height of a hedge could, in theory, spiral into losing everything. It was a small government with the power of a large one and the temperament of a disappointed librarian. You had traded the tyranny of a distant king for the tyranny of a nearby neighbour named Carol, and honestly, at least the king lived far away. Carol lived across the street, and Carol was watching your recycling. It is time to meet the Joneses, though you will never actually catch them doing anything wrong. They just always had the newer car, the bigger grille, the vacation slides nobody asked to see. And the golden rule of the suburbs was simple. Whatever they had, you now needed. Not wanted, needed. Their above-ground pool triggered a neighbourhood arms race. Their new minivan made yours look like a rusting apology. Keeping up with the Joneses was less a hobby and more a competitive sport with no finish line, no trophy, and a scoreboard measured entirely in things you could not afford. The Joneses were never one specific family, of course. They were everyone and no one, the shifting phantom of whoever had just bought the thing you did not have. One month it was the Petersons and their new deck. The next it was the Garcias and their satellite dish, a great grey flower blooming on the side of the house, pulling in 200 channels of programming nobody would ever fully watch. You did not need 200 channels. Nobody needed 200 channels. But the Garcias had them, and now, apparently so did you, on a payment plan. The competition was quiet, which made it worse. But he announced it. Nobody said the words out loud. It lived entirely in glances, in the slow drive-by, in the way a new purchase would appear in a driveway and register across the block like a change in barometric pressure. You would notice the fresh landscaping, the new siding, the boat, and something ancient and reptilian in your brain would whisper that you were falling behind, that the neighbours had levelled up, and that your own house was now, subtly, embarrassingly, last year's model. And the objects escalated, always. It began innocently enough with a nicer barbecue grill, a modest chrome upgrade for the patio. But grills led to patio furniture, and patio furniture led to a hot tub, and the hot tub demanded a gazebo, and the gazebo required landscaping, and suddenly you'd spent the equivalent of a small home renovation trying to win a war that existed only in the shared imagination of 6 households, who were all secretly doing the exact same thing to each other at the exact same time. The cruel joke was that the Joneses were not winning either. Behind their perfect driveway sat the same anxious math you were doing, the same stack of statements, the same quiet dread. The new car was leased, the pool was financed, the vacation slides documented a trip they were still paying off 8 months later. Everyone was performing prosperity for an audience that was too busy performing prosperity back to notice. It was a hall of mirrors, and every reflection was faking it, and every faker assumed they were the only one. Trying to opt out was nearly impossible because the game did not require your consent. You could decide, nobly, that you did not care about status, that you would drive the old car proudly and let the lawn be merely fine. And then a neighbour would mention, ever so gently, that they had just repaved their driveway, and you would find yourself lying awake at 2 a.m. calculating whether your driveway looked poor. It got in everywhere. It was the water you swam in. You could not keep up with the Joneses, and you could not stop trying, and the finish line kept moving, one new minivan at a time, forever. Ever get the feeling you were being watched? In the 90s suburbs, you absolutely were. Behind every set of mini blinds sat a quiet observer, tracking your comings, your goings, and the concerning hour at which your teenager was dropped off Saturday night. There were no security cameras yet, but there did not need to be, because there was Linda. Linda saw everything. Linda knew whose lawn guy came on Tuesdays and whose marriage was in trouble. Privacy was a theoretical concept, like flying cars. You had walls, sure, but the neighbours had windows, patience, and absolutely nothing better to do. The surveillance was analogue and relentless. It ran on curiosity, boredom, and an encyclopedic memory for other people's routines. The watchers knew when your car left in the morning and when it returned. They knew which nights you ordered in. They knew that a strange vehicle had been parked outside your house for 2 hours on Thursday, and they had already developed 3 competing theories about it, none of them flattering. You were the subject of ongoing research conducted by amateurs who would never publish but would absolutely gossip. The instrument of choice was the window, and the master technique was the blind parting, that subtle 2-finger separation of the slats that allowed the watcher to observe while remaining, in their own mind, completely undetected. You could feel it, that faint prickle on the back of the neck as you carried groceries inside, the sense that somewhere a slat had shifted. And you were right, it had. Across the street someone was cataloguing the number of bags, estimating the expense, and quietly wondering how you could afford it, given, everything. The strange part was that the watchers genuinely believed they were helping. This was neighbourhood safety, they would insist. They were keeping an eye out, and in fairness, sometimes they were, noticing the open garage, the unfamiliar prowler, the smoke that should not have been there. The line between a caring community and a low-grade panopticon was thin and frequently crossed in a single afternoon. The same neighbour who would call for help if your house caught fire would also, without hesitation, report the exact time your husband left and did not come back. There was no escaping it, because the watching went both ways and everyone knew it. You watched them too. You could not help it. You noticed the new car, the argument in the driveway, the police cruiser that pulled up one Tuesday and left without explanation. Everyone was a subject. Everyone was a spy, and the whole subdivision hummed with a low current of mutual observation that made genuine privacy impossible. You could close your curtains, but closing your curtains was itself an event, noted, interpreted, discussed. What are they hiding in there, the slats would wonder? And so you learned to live your entire life as a slightly edited public performance. You waved when you did not feel like waving. You kept the front of the house immaculate even when the inside was falling apart, because the front was the part that got observed. You developed a sixth sense for being seen, and a permanent low-level self-consciousness that followed you from the mailbox to the minivan. In a place designed for peace and privacy, you had somehow achieved the opposite. A home where you were never truly alone, watched not by cameras or kings, but by Linda, who had been standing at that window since 1991 and had absolutely no plans to move. Let's follow Dad, or try to, because he is already gone. He left before sunrise, swallowed by a highway of identical sedans, and he will return long after dinner, grey-faced and quietly humming with freeway static. The suburbs promised space and fresh air, but the fine print required trading 2 or 3 hours a day to the great asphalt god of the commute. Dad was less a person, and more a rumour confirmed on weekends. You knew he existed because the lawn kept getting mowed, and someone kept falling asleep during the evening news with a plate still balanced on his chest. The logic had seemed sound at the time. The jobs were in the city, where land was expensive and children were apparently not supposed to have yards. So the family moved outward, ever outward, chasing cheaper square footage into subdivisions built on former cornfields, and the price of all that space was paid not in money but in time, hours and hours of it, spent alone in a car staring at the bumper ahead. Dad had traded a small apartment near his work for a large house far from it, and the difference was measured in a lifetime of red brake lights. The morning departure was a small tragedy performed daily. Dad rose in the dark, ate something standing up, and slipped out before the kids were fully awake, a shadow with a travel mug. If you happened to catch him, he was already somewhere else, mentally merging onto the interstate, running the mileage in his head. By the time the sun was up and the household was loud with cereal and cartoons, he was 30 miles away, inching forward, part of a vast migration of 100,000 other dads all making the same slow pilgrimage toward the same distant office towers. The commute did something to a person. It hollowed out the edges of the day and filled them with a specific kind of nothing. The low hum of talk radio, the same billboards memorized to the point of madness, the meditative rage of a merge gone wrong. Dad arrived at work already tired and arrived home already spent, having given his best waking hours to the road. The house he worked so hard to afford was a place he mostly slept in. He was funding a life he did not have much time to actually live. Evenings were a study in depletion. Dad would finally pull into the driveway well after dark, moving with the slow gravity of a man who had left most of himself on the freeway. Dinner was often reheated, eaten quietly, questions about the day met with the honest and total exhaustion of someone whose day had been 4 hours of driving wrapped around 8 hours of work. Then came the sacred ritual of collapsing into the recliner. Remote in hand, asleep within 9 minutes, the plate still perched precariously on the chest, a small monument to a man who was doing his absolute best and rarely getting to see the point of it. The weekends were supposed to make up for it, and they tried valiantly too. Saturday and Sunday, Dad reappeared blinking, reintroduced to his own children, determined to be present, to coach the game, to fix the thing, to grill the meat. But 2 days is a thin bridge over 5, and the spectre of Monday's alarm loomed over Sunday afternoon like a storm cloud. He was a good father and a devoted provider, and the system he was providing within had quietly arranged for him to be absent from most of it. A beloved roomer, a familiar car in the driveway, the sound of a mower on Saturday, gone again before you woke on Monday, driving toward the horizon to pay for the house he barely got to enjoy. Now for the smallest survivor of the suburbs, the latchkey kid. That was you, home alone by 3:30, house key on a shoelace around your neck like a tiny medieval amulet warding off responsibility. Both parents worked, daycare was expensive, and the prevailing wisdom was that a 9-year-old plus a locked door plus a bowl of dry cereal equaled adequate supervision. You learned to make yourself invisible until dark, to never answer the phone with your real name, and to treat every creak of the settling house as a potential intruder. Independence, they called it. Mild dread is another word. The math that produced you was simple and a little sad. Somewhere along the way it had become normal, then necessary, for both parents to work, which meant that between the final school bell and the sound of a car in the driveway, there was a gap of several hours during which the household's youngest members were, functionally, on their own. And so, an entire generation of children was issued a key, given a short list of rules, and released into the empty afternoon with the solemn responsibility of not dying before dinner. The rules were memorized like sacred scripture. Lock the door behind you. Do not open it for anyone. If the phone rings, do not tell them you're alone. Say your mother is in the shower. Do not touch the stove. Do not tell people you have a key. The instructions were designed to make you seem accompanied, and to make the house seem occupied. An elaborate performance staged for the benefit of imaginary criminals who, in the collective suburban imagination, were apparently cruising the neighbourhood specifically hunting for solo 9-year-olds. The empty house had a particular quality to it, a silence that was not restful but attentive, as though the rooms were waiting for something. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked. Every settling beam and shifting pipe became a footstep, a presence, a reason to freeze mid-snack and listen with the intensity of a hunted animal. You developed a rich internal life composed largely of low-grade fear and elaborate escape plans. You knew which closet you would hide in. You had rehearsed it. The house was safe. It was always safe. But nobody had told your nervous system that, and the afternoons were long. Television became the loyal companion of the latchkey hours, a flickering guardian that filled the silence and kept the imaginary intruders at bay. You watched whatever was on, absorbing an unsupervised education in cartoons, talk shows, and the occasional program you were absolutely not supposed to see. Snacks were self-administered and questionable. Homework happened, in theory. Mostly you managed the delicate hours between abandonment and reunion by any means available, counting down to the beautiful moment when a car door slammed outside and the house became once again a place with an adult in it. And here is the strange thing. You were fine, mostly. You survived. You learned to cook a passable something, to entertain yourself, to be alone without falling apart, and those skills would follow you for life. But you also learned other things, quieter things, about what it feels like to be a small person responsible for your own safety before you can spell responsibility. You grew a hard little shell of self-reliance and a permanent alertness to empty rooms. The suburbs called it building character, and maybe it did. But somewhere in there was a 9-year-old on a couch at 4 p.m, jumping at the sound of the ice maker, waiting for the sky to darken and the car to come home, learning young that independence and loneliness are frequently the same thing wearing a house key around its neck. While the parents were busy or absent or simply exhausted, someone had to raise the kids, and that someone had a remote control. The television was babysitter, best friend, and moral educator all in one glowing box. You learned about the world through cartoons, sitcoms, and commercials engineered by grown adults to make you scream for sugary cereal in the grocery aisle. Screen time was not a concern back then. It was a parenting strategy. 4 hours in front of the tube kept you quiet, kept you still, and kept you from asking difficult questions like where exactly Dad went every day. The television sat in the place of honour, the true hearth of the suburban home, a wood-panelled altar around which the furniture arranged itself in humble worship. It was enormous, deep, and heavy enough to require 2 adults and a spiritual pep talk to move. It had knobs, then buttons, then gloriously a remote, which immediately became the most contested object in the household, hunted daily, lost in couch cushions, fought over like a sceptre. Whoever held the remote held power, and the power was absolute, and it was almost never held by a child. Saturday morning was the sacred window, the one time the airwaves belonged entirely to you. You would rise before dawn on the one day sleep was permitted, pad silently to the living room, and settle in for a marathon of cartoons stretching across the entire morning, a bowl of neon cereal balanced on your knees, the milk slowly turning a colour not found in nature. This was the reward for a week of school. This was freedom. And the whole beautiful ritual was interrupted every few minutes by commercials so precisely engineered to detonate a child's desire that resistance was medically impossible. Ah, the commercials. Somewhere in a distant office, teams of adults with degrees studied exactly how to make you, a small child with no income, demand things from your parents with maximum intensity. The toys gleamed. The cereal sang. Everything was brighter and more thrilling on television than it could ever be in real life, a fact you would rediscover with fresh heartbreak every time the actual toy arrived, smaller and quieter, and requiring batteries that were never included. You were being farmed for your influence over the family grocery list, and you were an eager, defenseless crop. The programming itself became your true curriculum, teaching lessons no school included. You absorbed the rhythm of the sitcom, where every problem resolved in 22 minutes with a hug and a lesson. You learned what families were supposed to look like, what houses were supposed to contain, what a normal life was apparently meant to be, all of it delivered by professional actors on sets far nicer than your beige living room. Reality began to feel like a slightly disappointing rerun of the show, and you, the viewer, were left quietly comparing your actual family to the televised one, which always seemed to have better lighting and funnier problems, and the parents let it happen, not out of neglect but out of sheer survival. A parent who has commuted, worked, cooked, and cleaned does not have the energy to also personally entertain a restless child, and the television offered a miracle: silence. Put on the show, and the small loud human became still, absorbed, safely contained for hours. It was the cheapest, most reliable babysitter ever invented, and it never called in sick. So the kids were raised in no small part by a glowing box that loved them in its way, taught them, distracted them, and sold them things, while the exhausted adults finally sat down for a moment of peace, half watching the same screen, all of them lit blue in the dark, a family gathered together in the one activity that required nothing of anyone. Let's head to the beating heart of 90s suburban life, the mall. This was your town square, your cathedral, your climate-controlled promised land of fountains and pretzels and stores that only sold candles. Teenagers loitered, parents power-walked, and everyone pretended the fluorescent lighting was flattering. But even at its peak, the mall was quietly hollow. It replaced the old downtown, the corner shops, the actual community, with a private building where you were only welcome as long as you were buying something. It felt like abundance. It was really just a very cheerful way to be lonely in a crowd. The mall was a marvel of engineering designed to separate you from your money as pleasantly as possible. There were no clocks. There were no windows. Time did not exist inside the mall, only an eternal, seasonless present lit by the same soft glow whether it was noon or evening, July or January. You entered for one specific item and emerged 3 hours later, disoriented, holding 4 bags, having somehow purchased a pretzel, a candle, and a shirt you would never wear. The building was a beautiful trap, and everyone walked in willingly, again and again, all weekend long. For the teenager, the mall was salvation, the one place in the entire carless suburb where you could actually go. You could not walk anywhere else. There was nowhere else. But the mall could be reached, dropped off by a parent at the entrance with a crumpled bill and a pickup time, and inside its air-conditioned expanse you were, for a few precious hours, free. You did not buy much. You could not afford much. You simply existed there, roaming in packs, orbiting the food court, performing the ancient adolescent ritual of being seen while pretending not to want to be. The food court was the mall's chaotic soul, a fluorescent bazaar of a dozen competing cuisines, each one boiled down to its greasiest, most sample-sized essence. Someone was always holding out a toothpick of teriyaki chicken. The air was a thick perfume of cinnamon rolls, frying oil and fountain soda. You ate standing up or crammed into moulded plastic seats bolted to the floor, surrounded by the roar of 100 conversations, and it was somehow both deeply social and completely anonymous. You knew no one. You were among thousands. It was togetherness without connection, the mall's specialty. And the stores, the endless stores, each one a small themed world. There was the store that sold only bath products, aggressively scented enough to be detected from 200 feet away. The store that sold only posters, its narrow aisles a shrine to whatever the teenagers were worshipping that year. The department stores anchoring each end like great Leviathans, vast and carpeted and slightly overwhelming, their perfume counters staffed by people armed with spray bottles and no mercy. You could buy anything at the mall, which meant you were always subtly being reminded of everything you did not yet own. But look closer, and the hollowness showed through the polish. The mall was not a town square, though it played one on the weekends. A real town square was public, free, a place you could simply be. The mall was private property, and your welcome there was strictly conditional on your role as a shopper. Loiter too long without buying and security would drift over. There was nowhere to simply sit and talk without an implied transaction. It offered all the appearance of community, the crowds, the bustle, the shared space, while quietly charging admission in the form of retail. You went there to feel less alone, surrounded by hundreds of strangers doing the same thing, and you left, bags in hand, wallet lighter, having connected with no one at all, back to the car, back to the identical house, having spent the afternoon at the loneliest party in America. Now let's talk about the little plastic rectangle that made all of this possible, the credit card. In the 90s, credit was raining from the sky like confetti. Banks mailed you offers, colleges handed cards to teenagers, and suddenly everyone could afford everything, or at least the monthly minimum on everything. Want the bigger television? Charge it. New patio set to beat the Joneses? Charge it. The suburbs ran on the comforting illusion that debt was just delayed happiness. Nobody read the interest rate. Nobody wanted to. You simply signed, you smiled, and you quietly began working the rest of your life to pay for a couch. The offers arrived like weather, a steady precipitation of envelopes promising pre-approval, congratulating you on your excellent standing, inviting you to accept a line of credit you had not requested and did not need. You were pre-approved for things you had never considered buying. The mailbox filled with plastic promise, and each card came with a limit that felt dangerously like money, a number that whispered you could have this, all of this, right now, and worry about the rest later. Later was the magic word. The entire system ran on the seductive fiction of later. The math was designed to be invisible. Nobody advertised the interest rate on a billboard. What they advertised was the low monthly minimum, that reassuringly small number that made a 4-figure purchase feel like a modest little commitment. Pay just a bit each month, the statement suggested gently, and the balance became a background hum, a manageable ache. What went politely unmentioned was that paying the minimum meant paying for that television roughly forever, the interest quietly compounding in the dark, so that the couch you bought once you would end up paying for 2 or 3 times over the slow years to come. And the timing was cruel, because the credit card arrived precisely when the pressure to spend was at its peak. The Joneses had the new grill. The mall was full of things. The house needed furnishing, the kids needed everything, and the culture insisted relentlessly, cheerfully, that a good life was a purchased one. The credit card resolved the tension between what you earned and what you were expected to own, papering over the gap with plastic. You could finally keep up. You could finally have the life that everyone on television so clearly had. You just had to sign, and the bill would come later, always later. The debt accumulated the way weight does, invisibly, then all at once. A charge here, a charge there, each one reasonable in isolation, none of them the problem, all of them together the problem. The statements grew heavier. The minimum payment crept upward, and a particular kind of quiet dread took up residence in the household, a knot that tightened when the mail came, a subject that could not be discussed at dinner, a stack of envelopes shoved in a drawer and not opened. On the outside, the family looked prosperous, thriving, keeping up beautifully. On the inside, it was treading water in an ocean of interest, and the water was rising. The deepest trick of the whole arrangement was how normal it made everything feel. Debt was not shameful. It was simply how things were done, how everyone lived, how the beige houses got filled with furniture and the driveways with second cars. To live within your means, to buy only what you could actually afford, began to feel almost eccentric, even suspicious, a quaint refusal to participate in the good life. So you participated. You charged the vacation, the appliances, the pool that made the neighbours jealous, and you told yourself you would pay it down soon, when things eased up, when the raise came. The raise came, and so did new expenses, and the balance never quite fell. You had achieved the dream on credit, and the dream, it turned out, was leasing you your own life at a rate you never read, on a timeline that had no end, in a house you were paying for twice, sitting on a couch you would owe money on long after you'd forgotten where you bought it. Beware the invitation to a friendly little gathering at Debbie's house, because it is a trap dressed as a social event. This was the golden age of the home-based business, where your neighbour sold you plastic containers, scented candles, cosmetics, or vitamins, and desperately wanted you to sell them too. You came for the wine and cheese cubes and left with a starter kit and a vague sense of financial obligation. It was friendship weaponized into a sales funnel. Everyone was somebody's downline. Everyone was chasing a garage full of unsold product, and nobody was allowed to simply enjoy a Tuesday without being recruited. The invitation always arrived wrapped in warmth. Debbie just wanted to have a few friends over, nothing formal, just some snacks and a chance to catch up. And you, being a decent person who liked Debbie, said yes, because who says no to snacks and catching up? You did not read the fine print because there was no fine print, only Debbie's slightly too bright smile and the words "come see what I have been up to," which, in the suburban dialect of the 90s, translated directly to "bring your checkbook." You arrived to find the living room rearranged into something between a birthday party and a sales conference. Folding chairs in a semicircle, a table draped in product, artfully lit, a pad of order forms placed casually within reach, as though it had simply wandered in, and Debbie, transformed. No longer just your neighbour, but a woman on a mission, a woman who had watched a motivational video that morning, a woman who was about to change your life whether you had asked her to or not. The presentation was a masterpiece of gentle coercion. Debbie demonstrated the miraculous plastic container that would keep lettuce fresh until the heat death of the universe. She passed around the candle that smelled like a memory you did not have. She spoke of the products the way missionaries speak of salvation, and woven through it all ever so smoothly was the real pitch. That you too could do this. You too could be free. You too could quit your job and build an empire from your own kitchen table, if you would just, tonight, get started. The pressure was social, which made it far worse than any pushy stranger. You could hang up on a telemarketer. You could not hang up on Debbie, who lived 4 doors down, who had watched your kids, whose eyes were now fixed on you with a hope so earnest it hurt to disappoint. So you bought something. Everyone bought something. You did not need the container or the candle or the collection of vitamins, but you needed to leave, and buying was the toll. And if Debbie was especially good, you left not just with a purchase, but with a starter kit and a nagging sense that you had signed up for something. The dark heart of it was the pyramid, though no one used that word. You did not really make money selling the product. You made money, in theory, by recruiting other people to sell the product, who recruited others, on and on, a great tapering tower of hope in which almost everyone at the bottom lost money, and a very few at the top got rich off everyone's garages full of stock. Debbie was not a villain. Debbie had been sold the dream too at someone else's party, by someone else's too bright smile. She had a spare bedroom stacked with inventory she believed in, and could not move, and she was throwing this party because the only way out was to pull you in. You bought the candle, you went home, and a week later an invitation arrived from Karen down the street, who just wanted to have a few friends over. Let's talk about dinner, and try to keep an open mind. The 90s suburban kitchen ran on convenience, which meant cream of something soup, a bag of frozen vegetables, and a topping of crushed crackers baked into a beige unified field of casserole. Then there was the gelatin. Oh, the gelatin. Fruit suspended in it, vegetables suspended in it, occasionally things that had no business being suspended in anything. Nutrition took a backseat to speed, and to the promise printed on every box. It was food designed by marketing departments and reheated by exhausted people. It filled you up. Whether it nourished you is another matter entirely. The casserole was the workhorse of the suburban table, and its genius was that it required no skill, only assembly. You did not cook a casserole so much as construct it, layering whatever protein was on sale over whatever starch was in the pantry, binding it all together with a can of soup so processed it qualified as a building material. Then into the oven it went, emerging, bubbling, golden, and completely uniform in colour. A single warm mass in which the individual ingredients had surrendered their identities for the greater good. You ate it because it was there, and there was a lot of it, and there would be leftovers for days. The convenience economy had arrived in full force, and the kitchen bowed to it gratefully. Boxes promised dinner in minutes. Powders became sauces with the addition of water and faith. The freezer filled with meals that required only heat and patience, entire dinners engineered in distant factories and delivered frozen solid to your door via the grocery store. Cooking, that ancient human activity, had been quietly outsourced to corporations, and what came back was fast, cheap, salty, and shelf-stable. Food that had been designed less to be eaten than to be sold. And then the gelatin. History will struggle to explain the gelatin. Somewhere it had been decided that the height of culinary sophistication was to suspend things in a quivering, translucent mould, and the suburbs embraced this with terrifying enthusiasm. Fruit made a certain sense. But then came the savoury experiments, the shredded carrots, the celery, the cubes of ham, the small horrors floating in a wobbling dome of flavoured gelatin, presented at the potluck with genuine pride. You approached the buffet, you saw it glistening under the fluorescent lights, and you had to decide in real time whether social politeness required you to eat a spoonful of suspended vegetables. It usually did. The portions matched the philosophy. More was better, and abundance was the point. This was food as reassurance, heavy and filling and plentiful, a hedge against any lingering memory of leaner times. Plates were loaded, seconds were expected. The goal was not delicacy, but sufficiency, the comfortable heaviness of a meal that sat in you like ballast. Vegetables, when they appeared, arrived boiled into submission, or drowned in a creamy sauce, their nutrition a rumour by the time they reached the fork. Fresh was for people with time. The suburb had no time. The suburb had a microwave. What was quietly lost in all of this was the meal itself, the idea of food as something made with care and eaten with attention. Dinner became a refuelling stop, assembled fast, consumed faster, often in shifts, sometimes in front of the television. It fed the family and freed up the exhausted cook, and by those measures it was a triumph. But something got traded away in the beige convenience of it, some connection between the people at the table and the thing on their plates. You ate the casserole, it did its job. You were full, briefly, and then you were not, and the box promised the next one would be even faster, and it was. And the years went by one reheated dinner at a time, nourishing enough to survive on, hollow enough to forget by morning. Now, let's peek inside the medicine cabinet, quietly, because this part nobody discussed. Behind the smiling face of the suburban homemaker was often a small prescription bottle, helping her get through the endless sameness of the days. The pressure to keep a perfect house, raise perfect children, and radiate perfect calm was immense, and the answer prescribed with alarming ease was a little something to take the edge off. It was not talked about at the potluck. It was not admitted at the school fundraiser. It just sat in the cabinet next to the good towels, quietly holding the whole performance together. The expectations placed on her were both impossible and unspoken. She was to keep a spotless home, produce dinner nightly, manage the schedules of everyone in the household, volunteer at the school, remain endlessly pleasant, and do all of it while looking rested and appearing to enjoy it. Nobody had explicitly demanded this. It simply hung in the air, absorbed from television, from magazines, from the woman next door who seemed to manage it effortlessly, though of course she was managing it exactly the same way, with a little help from the cabinet and a great deal of practice pretending. The days themselves were a peculiar kind of trap, full of labour yet strangely empty. She was rarely alone and rarely with anyone who could hold a real conversation. The work was constant but invisible, the kind that is only ever noticed when it stops, the laundry that reappears, the meals that dissolve, the clean floor that will be dirty by noon. The isolation was profound. Each woman sealed in her own beige house, performing the same private marathon, waving to each other across the driveways, none of them admitting how heavy it had all become. And so the prescription pad appeared, wielded by a doctor who listened to a tired woman describe her nerves, her sleeplessness, her vague and formless unhappiness, and reached for the quickest available answer. Something to calm her down, something to smooth the edges. The pills were legal, respectable, prescribed by a professional, and therefore entirely acceptable in a way that other coping mechanisms were not. They came in a proper bottle with a proper label, and they lived in the medicine cabinet like any other household necessity, between the aspirin and the mouthwash, part of the machinery of getting through. The genius and the tragedy was how well it worked, at least on the surface. With the edge taken off, she could smile at the potluck, endure the HOA meeting, absorb the small disappointments of the day without cracking. The performance held. The house stayed clean, the children stayed fed, the Christmas card stayed cheerful. Nobody looking in from outside would have seen anything but a capable woman managing beautifully. That was the whole point. The pills did not fix the emptiness at the centre of the arrangement. They simply made it possible to keep functioning inside it, without asking the dangerous question of why it felt so hollow. The deepest silence surrounded the whole subject. This was not discussed, not admitted, not named. To speak of it would be to acknowledge that the perfect suburban life was, for many of the women living it, quietly unbearable, and that acknowledgement was not permitted. So it stayed hidden, a private struggle multiplied across 10,000 identical kitchens, each woman assuming she was the only one, each one reaching for the same small bottle behind the mirror. The suffering was invisible precisely because it was so widely shared and so thoroughly denied. She kept the house immaculate. She kept the smile in place, and she kept the little bottle where no one would see it. The quiet chemical scaffolding holding up a dream that had promised her everything, and somehow left her alone in the middle of a full house, taking the edge off an afternoon that looked, from the street, absolutely perfect. Let's pour a drink, because everyone else already has. In the 90s suburbs, alcohol was less a vice and more a lubricant for the entire social machine. There was wine at the book club, beer at the barbecue, and a well-stocked bar cart that got a serious workout the moment the sun dipped below the fence line. Unwinding after work was practically mandatory, and the line between unwinding and drowning was drawn very faintly and never discussed. Everyone laughed a little too loud at the block party. Everyone drove home a little too confidently, and nobody, absolutely nobody, called it a problem. The drinking was woven so thoroughly into adult life that it had become nearly invisible, simply the texture of how grown-ups existed. The workday ended and the drink began, a ritual as automatic as taking off your shoes. It was how you transitioned from the stress of the commute to the demands of the evening, a small chemical bridge between one exhausting role and the next. Nobody questioned it because everybody did it, and a behaviour universal enough stops registering as a behaviour at all. It was just what you did at 5 o'clock, and at 6, and sometimes at 4:30 if it had been that kind of day. The social calendar ran on it entirely. Every gathering came pre-lubricated. The dinner party had its wine, the barbecue its beer, the holiday its punch, the golf its clubhouse round afterward. To attend a suburban social event was to drink, and to not drink was to invite gentle, persistent questioning about why you were not drinking, as though sobriety were the eccentric choice requiring explanation. The bar cart in the living room was a status object, gleaming with bottles, the decanters catching the light, a small monument to the family's capacity for hospitality and, quietly, for consumption. The book club was a particularly beloved fiction. Ostensibly a gathering to discuss literature, it functioned reliably as a sanctioned evening of wine, where the book was mentioned briefly, if at all, before the conversation drifted into the far more pressing matters of neighbourhood news and the second bottle. Nobody was fooled, least of all the attendees, who understood perfectly that the book was the cover story and the wine was the event. It was a way for tired adults to gather and unwind under the respectable banner of self-improvement, and everyone honoured the arrangement without ever naming it. The danger hid in plain sight, at the end of the evening, in the driveways. The gathering wound down, the goodbyes were said, and then everyone climbed into their cars and drove home, along the same dark suburban roads, having had, by any honest accounting, several drinks too many. This was treated as entirely normal, a private matter, a personal judgment call made by adults who felt, as they always did, that they were fine. The number of times this ended badly was not something anyone wished to dwell on, and so nobody did, and the driving home continued, block party after block party, year after year. Beneath the cheerful clink of ice was something harder to look at directly. For some, the cocktail hour that never ended was not a social lubricant but a slow dependency, a way of getting through days and marriages and disappointments that had grown too heavy to face sober. The drink that took the edge off eventually became the thing the edge was built around. But the culture offered no room to notice this, no vocabulary for it that did not sound like an accusation, and so the heavy drinker and the social drinker sat side by side at the same barbecue, holding the same beer, indistinguishable, one of them quietly drowning while everyone laughed a little too loud at the same jokes. The sun went down, the glasses refilled, and nobody, absolutely nobody, called it a problem, because to call it a problem would have meant admitting how many people had one. Forget the internet. The fastest information network in 1994 ran entirely on phone cords and fences. One whispered detail at the bus stop in the morning could complete a full lap of the subdivision by dinner, mutating slightly with each retelling until a minor fender bender became a scandalous double life. Gossip was the suburb's true currency, traded eagerly and spent recklessly. Your reputation was fragile, public, and permanently one overheard argument away from ruin. You could move away, change your number, repaint the house. But the story the neighbourhood decided to tell about you, that one stayed put forever. The network was invisible but astonishingly efficient. It ran on the telephone, that beige rotary or push-button device tethered to the kitchen wall by a cord long enough to let a person pace the entire room while delivering news. It ran on the fence, the back and forth of neighbours leaning over the property line with the day's developments. It ran on the school pickup line, the grocery store aisle, the driveway chat that started as a wave and lasted 40 minutes. Information moved through these channels at a speed that would embarrass any modern technology, and it moved with a specificity that was frankly alarming. The raw material was everyone's private life, harvested through observation and speculation. A moving truck at the Hendersons meant a story, and the story would be assembled from available clues whether or not any facts were present. Why were they leaving? Was it money? Was it the marriage? Had you heard about the argument, the one someone's cousin's friend had definitely witnessed? The gaps in the actual information were filled in enthusiastically by imagination, and the finished narrative, polished by a dozen retellings, bore only a passing resemblance to whatever had actually happened. The mutation was the truly remarkable part. A story entered the network as one thing and emerged hours later as something else entirely, each teller adding a small embellishment, a plausible detail, a knowing implication. The car that got towed became the car that got repossessed, became the family that lost everything. The late-night visitor became the affair. Nobody lied exactly. They simply passed along what they had heard with a slight upgrade, and the compounding of these small upgrades, across many mouths, produced fiction indistinguishable from fact by the time it reached the far end of the street. And you were always a subject, whether you knew it or not. Somewhere, at some point, the network turned its attention to you, assembled its version of your life from whatever it could observe and invent, and circulated it without your knowledge or consent. You might catch a glimpse of it in a strange look at the mailbox, a conversation that stopped when you approached, a coolness you could not explain. You were a character in a story you had never read, written collaboratively by your neighbours, and there was no way to correct the record because you were never officially told what it said. The stakes were real because reputation was everything in a place built on appearances. The story the neighbourhood told about you shaped how you were treated, whether you were invited, whether your children were welcome, whether you belonged. And once a story took hold, it was nearly impossible to dislodge, because the network had no correction mechanism, only repetition, and repetition made even the flimsiest rumour feel like established truth. You could be a perfectly decent person undone by a single misinterpreted moment, filed permanently under the wrong category by a jury that never convened and never announced its verdict. So you were careful. You watched what you said and did and left visible in the driveway, knowing the fence had ears and the phone lines hummed, that your privacy was a polite fiction, and that somewhere, right now, someone was telling someone else a story about you, and it was already halfway around the block. Sometimes, in the middle of all that manicured perfection, a house would go quiet in a new way. A car would vanish from the driveway. A for sale sign would appear like a tombstone on the lawn. The 90s were the aftershock of a divorce boom, and the suburbs, built entirely around the idea of the intact family, did not quite know what to do when families quietly came apart inside them. The kids shuttled between two houses with two sets of everything. The neighbours murmured, and the split-level dream home, designed for one happy family, suddenly held the echo of two disappointed ones. The signs came slowly and then all at once. First the small things, noticed only in retrospect. The arguments that carried a little through the thin walls, the strained silence at the block party, the husband who started working later and later, the wife whose smile at the mailbox had gone brittle. The neighbourhood, ever watchful, sensed something shifting before anyone said a word, the way animals sense a storm, and then came the confirmation, the moving truck, the missing car, the sudden solo appearance of one parent at the school event that both had always attended together. The house itself seemed to register the change. A home built and furnished for a family of four does not adjust gracefully to becoming a home for three, or for a rotating cast depending on the custody calendar. The rooms felt too large. The second car's empty side of the garage became a small daily monument. The dinner table, sized for the whole family, now sat with an empty chair, or was quietly abandoned in favour of eating somewhere less pointed. The dream home had been designed around a specific fantasy of family life, and when that fantasy dissolved, the architecture stubbornly remained, a set built for a play that had stopped running. For the children, the arrangement produced a strange new geography of childhood. There was Mom's house, and there was Dad's house, and they lived between them, packing bags on schedule, forgetting things at the wrong one, maintaining 2 toothbrushes and 2 bedrooms and 2 slightly different sets of rules. They became small commuters, ferried back and forth, developing an early and unwanted expertise in adult logistics. Some adjusted with the terrifying resilience of children. Others carried the split quietly inside them, a divided map they would be redrawing for years, learning young that the stable, permanent home the suburb promised was not, in fact, guaranteed. The neighbourhood's response was a particular blend of sympathy and appetite. There was genuine kindness, the casseroles that appeared, the offers to watch the kids, the real warmth of people who understood that this could happen to anyone and might happen to them next. But there was also the machinery of gossip, humming to life, hungry for the story, assembling theories about whose fault it was and what had really been going on behind those closed doors all along. The divorcing family became simultaneously an object of compassion and the most interesting thing to happen on the street all year, and both of these things were true at once, and neither was entirely comfortable. What made it quietly devastating was the collision with the whole premise of the place. The suburb was sold as the setting for a certain kind of life, the lasting marriage, the raised children, the shared decades in the house with the good lawn. Divorce did not just end a marriage. It punctured the founding myth, the reassuring belief that if you did everything right, bought the right house in the right neighbourhood, the happy ending was secured. The for sale sign on the lawn was a message to the entire block, a reminder that the dream came with no guarantee, that the perfect houses could hold imperfect lives, and that any one of them, behind its identical beige facade, might be quietly coming apart. The neighbours murmured, and the sign went up, and the family scattered into new and smaller arrangements, and the house waited, empty, for someone else to move in and believe the dream all over again. Here is the golden rule of the suburbs, the one nobody wrote down but everybody knew. Keep it behind the door. Whatever went wrong inside the house, stayed inside the house. Money troubles, marriage troubles, a teenager going off the rails, a parent quietly unravelling, all of it got tidied away before the doorbell rang. The face you showed the street was pleasant, capable, and utterly untroubled. Appearances were not just important, they were the entire currency of respectability. So you smiled, you waved, you said everything was great, and you got very, very good at pretending. It was exhausting. It was also expected. The performance began the moment you stepped outside and did not end until the door closed behind you again. In the space between the front door and the car, you were on stage, and the audience was the entire neighbourhood, watching from behind the mini blinds, gathering material for the network. So you managed your face, you managed your posture, you managed the tone of voice you used with your children in the driveway, aware that a public loss of temper would be noted and discussed. Private life was strictly private, and the boundary between the two was the property line, patrolled constantly, crossed only in emergencies. What got hidden was almost everything real. The argument that had been raging until the second before the guests arrived was folded away instantly, replaced by warm hospitality and offers of a drink. The stack of overdue bills went into the drawer, the struggling child's report card, the drinking problem, the crumbling marriage, the quiet depression settling over the household like a fog, all of it got swept out of sight, because to reveal any of it would be to admit that the perfect life was not perfect, and that admission was simply not made, not to the neighbours, often not even to each other. The tools of concealment were practised and precise. The immaculate front of the house, regardless of the chaos within. The cheerful answer to "How are you?" delivered so automatically it required no thought. The the careful curation of what visitors were allowed to see, the living room stage for guests while the real life of the family happened in rooms the guests would never enter. Families became skilled set designers, presenting an edited version of themselves to the world, and the editing was so consistent, so universal, that everyone assumed everyone else's edited version was simply the truth. And that was the cruelest part of the arrangement, the loneliness it manufactured. Because everyone was hiding, everyone assumed they were the only one with something to hide. You looked at the family across the street with their perfect lawn and their cheerful waves, and you thought, they have it figured out. Why can't we be like them? And they looked back at you and thought precisely the same thing. Two households, each drowning quietly, each convinced the other was swimming beautifully, each too committed to the performance to ever break character and discover they were struggling in the same water. The pretending that was supposed to preserve dignity instead guaranteed isolation. The exhaustion of it accumulated over years. Maintaining a facade is labour, constant and invisible, the effort of never quite relaxing, never quite being honest, never letting the mask slip in front of the people who lived closest to you. It hollowed out the possibility of real connection, because real connection requires letting someone see the parts you have hidden, and the whole system was designed to keep those parts hidden at all costs. So the suburb filled with people who knew each other's names and lawns and cars, but not their actual lives, waving across the divide, all of them fine, just fine, everything's great. The doors closing softly behind each of them as they retreated into the private truth they would never share, keeping it, as the rule demanded, behind the door. Let's talk about fear, because the suburbs were quietly terrified of a lot of things that were mostly not happening. There were warnings about strangers in vans, razor blades in candy, hidden messages in music played backward, and secret cults operating out of daycares. Whole neighbourhoods worked themselves into a lather over dangers that turned out to be almost entirely imaginary. The real risks, like the highway and the swimming pool and the medicine cabinet, sat quietly ignored. It was easier to fear the shadowy outsider than to look too closely at the tidy house next door. Panic, it turns out, is a lot more comfortable than reflection. The fears arrived in waves, each one gripping the collective imagination with total conviction, before receding to make room for the next. There was the stranger, always the stranger, the shadowy figure who wanted to snatch your children off the sidewalk, whose danger was so vivid and so constant that children were trained to fear all unfamiliar adults as a matter of survival. That most children who came to harm were harmed by people they knew was a fact too uncomfortable to fit the story, so it was quietly set aside in favour of the van at the curb, the man offering candy, the villain who was always, reassuringly, a stranger. The holidays brought their own seasonal terrors. There was the enduring conviction that trick-or-treat candy was laced with poison or studded with razor blades by anonymous neighbourhood sadists, a fear so powerful that parents inspected every wrapper and some hospitals offered to x-ray the haul. The actual documented cases of this happening were essentially non-existent, the whole phenomenon a kind of shared nightmare with almost no basis in fact. But the fear felt real, and feeling real was enough. And so an entire ritual of candy inspection grew up around a threat that had never meaningfully existed. Then there were the truly baroque panics, the ones that spiraled into genuine hysteria. The belief that popular music contained secret satanic messages, audible only when played backward, which sent well-meaning adults spinning records in reverse in search of evil. The conviction that networks of hidden cults were operating in plain sight, that ordinary institutions concealed unspeakable rituals, a fear that in some cases ruined real lives, sent innocent people to prison, and later collapsed entirely under the weight of its own impossibility. These were not fringe beliefs. They swept through respectable communities, discussed with grave seriousness at kitchen tables across the country. The pattern was always the same, and it was always instructive. The feared danger was external, dramatic, and largely fictional. The real dangers were mundane, close to home, and consequently unbearable to look at. Children were vastly more likely to be hurt in the family car, in the backyard pool, by the medications in the cabinet, than by any lurking stranger or backward-masked record. But those risks implicated the family itself, the choices and the objects and the ordinary life inside the beige house, and it was far more comfortable to project the danger outward onto a shadowy villain than to acknowledge that the threats lived at home, in the garage, in the medicine chest, in the driveway. There was underneath it all a strange comfort in the panic. To fear the stranger was to believe that danger came from outside, that the neighbourhood itself was safe, that if you just locked the doors and watched the windows and warned the children, you could keep the bad thing out. The panic reinforced the myth of the suburb as sanctuary, a good and orderly place threatened only by external forces. It was easier to hold a neighbourhood watch meeting about suspicious vehicles than to ask whether the tidy houses themselves might contain unhappiness, dysfunction, or quiet harm. So the suburb feared the van at the curb and inspected the candy and played the records backward, pouring its anxiety into imaginary threats, because the imaginary ones could be defeated with vigilance, and the real ones would have required looking inward, which nobody behind their carefully closed doors was prepared to do. Spare a thought for the suburban teenager, marooned in a sea of cul-de-sacs with nowhere to go and no way to get there. Everything interesting was a car ride away, and you did not have a car, so your entire adolescence took place in basements, parking lots, and the strip mall bench outside the sandwich shop. The boredom was profound, almost geological, and boredom, given enough time, curdles into mischief, into rebellion, into questionable haircuts and louder music, and a general determination to feel something. The suburbs were designed to keep teenagers safe. What they mostly did was keep them very, very bored. The geography was the enemy. The suburb had been engineered around the car and the family, and it had simply forgotten to account for the human being who was too old to be entertained by the backyard and too young to legally drive away from it. For that person, the vast, spread-out, carless landscape became a kind of open-air holding cell. The friend's house was 3 miles away. The one interesting store was across a highway with no sidewalk. The distances that a parent covered thoughtlessly in a car were, to a 14-year-old on foot or on a bike, genuine expeditions, and most of the time it was not worth the trip, so you stayed put and you stewed. The available territory was small and thoroughly explored. There was the basement, that dim carpeted refuge where teenagers gathered to do essentially nothing in the company of other teenagers, which was, to be fair, the entire point. There was the parking lot, the great neutral ground of suburban adolescence, where you leaned against cars and watched other people lean against cars. There was the strip mall with its bench, its sandwich shop, its convenience store that sold the sodas and snacks that constituted the local economy. You circulated among these few locations endlessly, a small herd grazing on the thin grass of whatever there was to do, which was almost nothing. The boredom itself became a substance, thick and heavy, filling the long afternoons and endless summers with a specific suburban emptiness. Time moved differently when there was nothing to do and nowhere to go. Hours sprawled. You memorized the ceiling of your bedroom. You watched things on television you didn't even like, because the alternative was the silence of a subdivision where nothing ever happened, where the most exciting event of the week was a moving truck or a police car passing through. The stimulation that a city offered its young people, the crowds and the chaos and the sheer eventfulness, was entirely absent here, replaced by quiet order and lawns, and boredom, as any parent should have predicted, did not stay quiet. It transformed. It went looking for something to do, and when it could not find anything wholesome, it improvised. The energy that had nowhere to go turned into small rebellions. The experiments with substances acquired from an older sibling, the reckless drives once someone finally got a license, the vandalism born purely of having nothing better to do on a Tuesday night. Music got louder and angrier because it had to carry all the feeling that the environment refused to provide. Hair and clothing became statements, deliberate disruptions of the beige uniformity, small flags planted in the war against sameness. There was a genuine loneliness underneath the restlessness, though teenagers would rarely name it. To be young is to want the world, and the suburb offered a cul-de-sac. It offered safety, which teenagers did not want, at the cost of freedom, which they wanted desperately. They were being protected from a city they longed to be lost in, kept behind the invisible walls of distance and dependence, waiting, always waiting, for the license, the car, the escape that would finally let them go somewhere, anywhere. That was not here. The suburb watched over them carefully and gave them nothing to do, and so they marked time in basements and parking lots, growing their hair, playing their music, aching for a horizon they could not yet reach, learning the peculiar suburban lesson that you can be perfectly safe and still feel like you're slowly disappearing. Every suburban house had one, and every suburban house pretended it did not exist. The basement. Half finished, faintly damp, lit by a single bulb of despair, it was where the family stored the things it could neither use nor throw away. The exercise bike turned coat rack, the boxes labelled miscellaneous, and underneath it all a smell, a specific mildewed cocktail of concrete, old carpet, and time. Some basements hid worse things than clutter, a slow seep of radon rising invisibly from the ground beneath. But mostly the basement was just where the house kept its secrets. Quietly, in the dark, waiting. The basement occupied a strange psychological zone in the geography of the home. It was part of the house, and yet not really of it, a below-ground annex where the normal rules of tidiness and presentation did not apply. Upstairs, everything was staged for company, immaculate and beige. Downstairs, the truth was allowed to accumulate. The basement was where the family's editing stopped, where the objects and the mess that had no place in the performance were sent to sit indefinitely, out of sight, below the surface, both literally and otherwise. It was, above all, the great archive of abandoned intentions. Here lay the exercise equipment purchased in a burst of January optimism, now draped in laundry, a monument to a resolution that had lasted 11 days. Here were the boxes never unpacked from the move, 3 moves ago, their contents a mystery nobody was curious enough to solve. Here was the craft project, the hobby kit, the profitable side business that was going to change everything, all of it entombed in the same dim space, layer upon layer of the family's discarded plans for who they had meant to become. The atmosphere was unmistakable and unforgettable. The basement had a temperature all its own, cooler than the rest of the house, and a dampness that never fully lifted, a moisture that lived in the concrete and the old carpet and the cardboard slowly softening in the corner. And it had the smell, that particular basement smell, impossible to describe and instantly recognizable, a blend of mildew and dust and stale trapped air, and the mineral tang of concrete, the smell of a space that the sun and the fresh air never quite reached. Descend the stairs and the smell greeted you, the olfactory signature of everything the house preferred to forget. Some basements harboured dangers more serious than clutter and gloom. Radon, an invisible, odourless gas, could seep up from the ground and pool silently in the lowest level of the house, an actual health hazard that most families never tested for and never thought about. Moisture bred mould behind the panelling. Old wiring waited in the walls of the half-finished rec room. The basement was where the house met the raw earth it was built on. And the earth did not always cooperate quietly, sending up water, gas, and slow decay into the space where the children were sometimes sent to play among the boxes. But mostly the basement was simply the honest floor of the house, the place where the pretending gave out. Upstairs, the family performed prosperity and contentment for the neighbours and for each other. Downstairs, in the dark, sat the accumulated evidence of a real life, imperfect and cluttered, and full of good intentions gone soft with damp. The basement held what could not be displayed and could not be released, the physical sediment of years, and it waited down there in the single bulb gloom, faintly humming with the furnace, faintly smelling of mildew and time, a quiet underground confessional that every house possessed and no house discussed, keeping the family's secrets in the dark beneath the beige, exactly where they had been sent to stay. Here is a cheerful thought to drift off to. Your dream home may have been trying to kill you very slowly. Older houses came with lead paint flaking gently onto the windowsills. Some had asbestos tucked into the pipes and popcorn ceilings. The brand new furniture and fresh carpet quietly off-gassed a chemical fog that everyone just called that new house smell and inhaled with pride. Nobody thought much about air quality. The windows stayed shut, the vents recirculated the same tired air, and the family breathed it all in, generation after generation, blissfully unaware that the house itself was a slow and patient participant in their day. Let's begin with the lead, because it was everywhere and nobody was worried. For decades, paint had been made with it, and that paint coated the walls, the trim, and the windowsills of countless homes. As it aged, it did not simply sit there politely. It chipped, it flaked, and most insidiously, it ground itself into fine dust every time a window slid up and down in its frame. That dust settled on the sills, on the floor, on the hands of small children who put their hands, as small children do, directly into their mouths. It was a quiet, invisible exposure happening in the sunniest rooms of the house. Then there was the asbestos, that miracle material that had been packed into buildings for its wonderful resistance to fire and heat. It wrapped the pipes, it hid in the ceiling tiles and the flooring and the textured popcorn ceiling you stared up at while falling asleep. As long as it stayed sealed and undisturbed, it mostly kept its secrets. But houses do not stay undisturbed. Renovations happened. Ceilings got scraped. Pipes got replaced. And every disturbance risked releasing fibres so fine they could float in the air for hours, waiting patiently to be breathed in, their consequences unfolding not for years but for decades. The new construction had its own quiet chemistry. That fresh carpet, that new furniture, those pressed wood cabinets and particle board shelves, all of them slowly exhaled a fog of chemicals into the sealed air of the home, the off-gassing that produced the beloved new house smell. People inhaled it with satisfaction, associating it with newness and success, never suspecting that the pleasant aroma of a freshly furnished room was, in fact, a collection of compounds steadily releasing themselves into every breath. The newer the house, the fresher the fog, and the prouder the owner of the smell. The sealed environment made everything worse. The modern suburban home was built to be efficient, which meant it was built to be tight, insulated and closed against the outside world, so the heating and cooling would not escape. The windows stayed shut. The same air circulated endlessly through the ducts, picking up whatever the house was shedding and delivering it back to the occupants over and over. There was no throwing open the windows to air the place out, not when doing so wasted the expensive climate control. So the family breathed the recycled air, and whatever was in it stayed in it, concentrating quietly in the comfortable sealed box they called home. The truly unsettling part was the innocence of it all. Nobody was being careless in any way that felt careless. They were doing everything right, buying the nice house, filling it with new things, keeping it warm and cool and sealed and comfortable. The threats were invisible, odourless, or pleasantly scented, slow-acting, and entirely undramatic. There was no moment of danger, no alarm, just the ordinary daily act of living inside a structure that was, in small ways, working against the bodies it sheltered. The dream home did its job, keeping the family warm, dry and safe from the weather, while the walls flaked and the pipes whispered and the carpet exhaled, and everyone breathed deep and called it home and slept soundly inside it. Night after beige night. Nothing announced suburban success quite like a backyard pool, that shimmering blue rectangle of leisure and quiet menace. It was the ultimate flex, the thing that made the whole block jealous every July. It was also, statistically speaking, one of the most dangerous objects a family could own. Toddlers wandered, gates got left open, teenagers dared each other into shallow water at midnight. The pool required constant chemicals, constant vigilance, and a level of supervision that busy, distracted, cocktail-hour parents did not always provide. It looked like paradise. It behaved like a very patient trap that only occasionally sprung, which was somehow worse. The pool was, first and foremost, a status object, and everyone understood this without saying it. To own one was to have arrived, to have the disposable income and the property and the leisure that the whole suburban project promised. On a hot day, the family with the pool was the family that mattered, the destination, the envy of the block. The neighbours could hear the splashing over the fence and feel, appropriately, that they were missing out. It was a large, expensive, water-filled advertisement for the family's success, and it worked beautifully, right up until you considered what it actually was. Because what it actually was, underneath the glamour, was a large volume of water sitting in the backyard where the children played, and water, in that quantity, is not a toy. It is a hazard that never sleeps, never takes a day off, and requires no malice to do harm. A toddler is drawn to water with a fascination that adults find charming, right up until the moment it becomes terrifying. A gate left unlatched, a moment of distraction, a parent who assumed another parent was watching, and the shimmering paradise revealed its other nature, silently, without warning, in the time it took to answer a telephone. The supervision the pool demanded was constant and total, and constant total supervision was exactly what the busy suburban household could not reliably provide. The parents were tired, distracted, spread thin across 100 obligations. The cocktail hour was in full swing. The party had guests and noise and the assumption, dangerous and universal, that in a crowd of adults surely someone was keeping an eye on the kids. It was precisely in these moments of divided attention, of assumed coverage, of relaxed adult socializing, that the pool was most dangerous, sitting there calm and blue while everyone looked the other way. Beyond the ultimate danger, there was the daily grind of the thing, the relentless maintenance that the brochures never mentioned. The pool had to be chemically balanced, a constant chemistry experiment involving chlorine and other compounds stored, alarmingly, in the garage next to the toys. It had to be skimmed and vacuumed and filtered. The chemicals themselves were hazardous, capable of burning skin and lungs if mishandled, and they lived in the home in quantities that would concern anyone who thought about it, which nobody did. The paradise required a steady input of labour and toxic materials just to remain a paradise rather than a green swamp. And yet the pools kept getting dug, because the appeal was simply too strong and the danger too easy to push aside. The image of the family splashing happily on a summer afternoon was so powerful, so central to the suburban fantasy, that it overwhelmed the sober statistics about what backyard pools did to young children every year. The danger was invisible most of the time, the water calm and inviting, the tragedy rare enough to feel like it happened to other people. So the block filled with shimmering blue rectangles, symbols of success and sites of quiet risk, beautiful and patient, giving the family its proudest summers and asking in exchange for a vigilance that the exhausted, distracted, celebrating household could not always afford to pay. It looked like paradise. Mostly it was, and mostly is a heavy word to carry in a backyard. Let's talk about how you ended up in this particular subdivision, because that was rarely an accident. Where you lived in the 90s quietly determined almost everything. The school your kids attended, the value of your house, the doors that opened or closed before you even knocked. Whole neighborhoods had been sorted and sifted over decades by forces most residents preferred not to examine over coffee. The suburb sold itself as a fresh start available to anyone. In practice, the welcome mat was laid out selectively, and the tidy borders of your perfect neighborhood had been drawn a long time ago, in ink that did not wash out. The zip code was not just an address, it was a destiny, a compact code that unlocked or locked an entire set of outcomes. It determined which public school your children would attend, and the school determined a great deal about the opportunities that would follow them for the rest of their lives. It shaped the value of your home, the single largest investment most families would ever make, appreciating or stagnating according to forces largely beyond any individual's control. It signaled things to lenders, to employers, to insurers, a shorthand for who you were assumed to be, delivered before you had said a word. This sorting had happened over decades, through mechanisms that were rarely discussed at the block party but shaped it profoundly. Neighborhoods had been mapped, ranked, and divided long before the current residents arrived, and the patterns those old decisions established had a way of persisting, self-reinforcing, quietly channeling who ended up where. The lines on the map were not natural features. They had been drawn by people, according to priorities that did not always survive close examination, and the tidy, uniform, comfortable neighborhood was in part the product of that long history of drawing lines and deciding who belonged inside them. The public schools made the whole system visible if you looked. Because they were funded and populated according to the neighborhoods they served, the schools reflected and amplified the sorting that the housing had already accomplished. The good school district was itself a feature that raised home prices, which in turn determined who could afford to move in, which in turn shaped the school, a loop that fed on itself and grew more entrenched with each cycle. Parents chose the neighborhood for the school, and the school stayed a certain way because of who could afford the neighborhood, and around it went, generation after generation. The suburb's self-image made none of this easy to see. The story it told about itself was one of openness, of the fresh start, of the good honest family that worked hard and earned its place in the pleasant subdivision. And for the families who made it in, that story felt true, because they had worked hard and they had earned their homes. What the story left out was the selectiveness of the welcome, the way the borders had been arranged so that only certain families found the path smooth, the way the fresh start was more available to some than to others, in patterns that had been set long before and were rarely named aloud. Living inside it, most residents simply experienced their neighborhood as normal, as the natural result of everyone finding their appropriate place. The comfort of the good zip code felt earned and unremarkable, just the reward for good choices, but the tidiness of the subdivision, its uniformity of income and appearance and background, was not an accident of individual decisions freely made. It was the visible surface of a deep and largely invisible history of sorting, a history written into the map itself, into the school boundaries and the property values and the quiet understanding of where one belonged. You had chosen your house, or so it felt. But the choices available to you had been shaped long in advance, in ink that did not wash out. On a map you were never shown. Try to walk somewhere. Go on. You cannot. The 90s suburb was engineered around the automobile so completely that leaving your house on foot felt like a cry for help. The grocery store was a car ride away. The school was a car ride away. A gallon of milk required a full expedition with keys and seat belts. Sidewalks either did not exist or led nowhere, trailing off hopefully into a drainage ditch. The suburbs promised freedom and space, then quietly took away your ability to go anywhere without 4 wheels and a full tank. You were free, technically, as long as you were driving. The entire landscape had been designed with the car as its central assumption, and once you noticed this, you could not stop noticing it. The distances between things were car distances, comfortable to drive and absurd to walk. The homes clustered in their subdivisions, the stores gathered in their distant retail centres, the schools and offices and everything else scattered across a wide, low, spread-out geography that made perfect sense from behind a windshield and no sense at all on foot. The suburb was not a place you moved through. It was a place you drove across from parking lot to parking lot, the spaces in between treated as mere distance to be covered. The sidewalk, that humble civic invention, had been quietly abandoned. In many subdivisions, it simply did not exist, the developers having seen no reason to build a walking path in a place where nobody was expected to walk. Where sidewalks did appear, they often led nowhere in particular, a stretch of pavement that ran along a few houses and then ended abruptly at a busy road with no crossing, or trailed off into the grass beside a drainage ditch. They were vestigial, decorative, a gesture toward the idea of walking rather than a real provision for it. To use them for actual transportation was to discover, quickly, that they did not connect to anything you might actually want to reach. The consequence was a strange kind of imprisonment dressed up as freedom. You had a large house and a spacious lot and all the room in the world, and you could not go anywhere. The teenager without a license was stranded. The elderly person who could no longer drive safely was trapped, their independence ending the moment their driving did. The child could not walk to a friend's house across the busy road. Everyone in the household who could not or should not drive was effectively confined, dependent on those who could, waiting to be ferried from place to place because the environment offered no other way to move through it. The car itself became less a convenience than a requirement, a piece of survival equipment as essential as food and shelter. You could not participate in suburban life without one. Getting a gallon of milk, that most trivial errand, became a small production involving keys, seat belts, a garage door, and a drive, because the nearest place to buy milk was a distance no sane person would walk, along roads no sane person would walk beside. The simplest needs of daily life had been placed just far enough away to make the automobile mandatory, and so every household organised itself around its cars, and the cars multiplied, and the driveways filled. Something quiet was lost in all of this, some texture of ordinary human life that walkable places take for granted. The chance encounter on the sidewalk, the errand run on foot, the child's independent journey to the corner store, the simple ability to step outside and go somewhere under your own power, all of it engineered out of existence in favour of the car and the road and the parking lot. The suburb had traded the walkable world for space and privacy in the open road, and the trade had seemed like a good one, more house, more yard, more freedom. But the freedom came with a key that had to be turned and a tank that had to be filled, and the moment you could not drive, the spacious, comfortable, sprawling dream revealed itself as a place you could not actually leave. For those with a little more money and a lot more anxiety, there was the ultimate suburban fantasy, the gated community. A wall, a gate, a bored guard in a little booth, and the comforting illusion that danger had been locked firmly on the other side. Inside, the lawns were greener, the houses grander, and the sense of superiority thicker than the humidity. but the gate did not actually keep much out. Trouble, it turned out, was perfectly capable of arriving through the front gate with a resident sticker on the windshield. The wall mostly kept in the loneliness and kept out the mail carrier. The gated community was the suburb's own logic taken to its natural conclusion. If the ordinary subdivision offered separation from the messiness of the wider world, the gated community offered separation with a physical barrier and a guard to enforce it. It was the deluxe version of the same dream, and it sold itself on the promise of safety and exclusivity, two things that the anxious and the affluent were happy to pay a premium for. Behind the wall, the promise went, life would be quieter, safer, better, insulated from whatever threats were assumed to prowl beyond the gate. The gate itself was the centerpiece of the fantasy, a solemn checkpoint that transformed the simple act of coming home into a small ceremony of belonging. There was the wall, running around the perimeter, declaring a boundary. There was the gate, opening only for the worthy. And there was the guard, often a bored figure in a small booth, waving through the residents and pausing the visitors, a human symbol of the security the whole arrangement promised. It looked serious. It felt serious. It gave residents the daily reassurance that they lived somewhere protected, somewhere set apart, somewhere that other people could not simply enter. Inside the walls, the suburban aesthetic reached its most polished expression. The lawns were greener, tended by services rather than harried homeowners. The houses were grander, the streets cleaner, the whole environment curated to a higher standard of manicured perfection. And with the elevated surroundings came an elevated sense of self, a quiet superiority that the residents wore like the resident sticker on the windshield. They had made it not just into the suburb, but into the exclusive enclave within it, the gated inner sanctum, and the knowledge of this settled comfortably over the community like the summer humidity. But the security was, in large part, theatre. The gate and the guard and the wall projected safety, but the actual dangers that touch people's lives rarely respected such barriers. Trouble did not always come from outside. From the shadowy intruder the wall was built to exclude, it came from inside, from the residents themselves, from the same human problems, the marriages and the money and the substances and the despair that lived behind every door everywhere. The gate that felt so protective stopped the mail carrier and the delivery driver and the casual visitor far more reliably than it stopped anything that actually caused harm, most of which already had a sticker on its windshield. And the wall did something else, something the brochures did not mention. It deepened the isolation that already defined suburban life. The ordinary subdivision was lonely enough, but at least it was porous, connected loosely to the world around it. The gated community sealed itself off further, cutting its residents off from the surrounding town, from chance encounters, from the ordinary flow of a shared public world. Inside, people lived among the greener lawns and grander houses, protected and exclusive and increasingly alone. Their community, a collection of separate households behind a shared wall, keeping the world out and, in the process, keeping themselves in, safe and superior and quietly sealed away. The mail carrier turned back at the gate, the loneliness circulating freely within. Here is the strange paradox at the centre of all this. You live surrounded by hundreds of people, packed into houses just feet apart, and yet you barely knew any of them. Everyone drove into their attached garage, closed the door behind them, and vanished. The front porch, once a place to sit and chat, had been replaced by a back deck with a tall privacy fence. You could go weeks seeing your neighbours only as a wave through a windshield. The suburbs gathered people together and then quietly arranged for them never to actually meet, engineering a kind of loneliness with excellent curb appeal. The density was real, even if the connection was not. The houses stood close together, separated by narrow strips of side yard. Hundreds of families packed into a small area, near enough to hear each other's mowers and smell each other's barbecues. By every physical measure, you were surrounded by people, embedded in a dense cluster of human beings. And yet the actual human contact was almost non-existent, the proximity producing not community but a kind of crowded solitude, everyone close and no one connected, a neighbourhood full of strangers who happened to share a street. The attached garage was the quiet villain of the story, an architectural feature that seemed like pure convenience and functioned as a machine for isolation. You drove home, pressed the button, and the door rose to admit you. You pulled inside, pressed the button again, and the door descended, sealing you into your house without ever having set foot outside, without a single moment of exposure to the street or the neighbours. You could come and go for weeks, for months, and never once stand in your own front yard where someone might see you and say hello. The garage swallowed you and your car together, and the neighbourhood never saw you arrive or leave. The disappearance of the front porch told the same story from a different angle. The porch had once been a semi-public space, a place at the front of the house where people sat in the evening, visible and available, positioned to greet passers-by and chat with neighbours, a small stage for casual community. The suburban home had quietly retired it. The action moved to the back, to the deck and the patio, screened from the street and enclosed by a tall privacy fence that announced in wood and nails the family's preference for seclusion. Leisure had moved behind the house, behind the fence, out of sight, and with it went the daily opportunities for the small encounters that build a neighbourhood into a community. What remained of neighbourly contact had shrunk to the barest gesture. The wave through the windshield as two cars passed, the wave across the driveway while unloading groceries, the wave that acknowledged another human being's existence while committing to absolutely nothing further. You could conduct an entire relationship with the family next door through waves alone, knowing their car, their schedule, their children's approximate ages, and nothing else. Not their struggles, not their story, not even, sometimes, their names. The wave was community reduced to its smallest possible unit, a friendly signal that maintained the appearance of neighbourliness while requiring none of its substance. And the deepest cruelty was that the loneliness was invisible, because it looked so much like success. From the street, the neighbourhood was a picture of the good life, the tidy houses, the manicured lawns, the two cars in every driveway. It had, as the saying goes, excellent curb appeal. But curb appeal is a description of a surface, and beneath the pleasant surface lived hundreds of families, each sealed in its own separate box, coming and going through automatic doors, relaxing behind privacy fences, connected to each other by nothing more than the occasional wave. The suburb had promised community and delivered proximity, had gathered people close and kept them strangers, engineering out of the human landscape the very connection it seemed designed to provide. You were never alone in the suburb. You were just lonely, which is a different and much heavier thing, and it came, like everything else, with a beautiful lawn out front. Once a year, the entire performance reached its glorious peak. The family Christmas card, everyone in matching sweaters, arranged in front of the fireplace, beaming as though the previous 12 months had been nothing but joy. The photo took 45 minutes, several threats, and at least one child crying just out of frame. But the finished card told a flawless story, mailed to hundreds of people who would nod approvingly and mail back their own equally flawless version. It was a nationwide exchange of carefully staged happiness. Nobody put the argument on the card, nobody put the debt on the card, just the sweaters. The card was the annual masterwork of the family's public relations department, which is to say the mother who conceived it, arranged it, and executed it with the determination of a general planning a campaign. There would be a theme. There would be coordinating outfits, purchased for the occasion, the matching sweaters or the colour-coordinated ensembles that no family had ever worn on any ordinary day. There would be a setting, carefully chosen, the fireplace or the tree or the tasteful outdoor backdrop, and it would all come together into a single perfect image representing the family at its absolute, entirely fictional best. The making of the image bore no resemblance to the serenity of the final product. The photo session was a small war, waged over the better part of an hour, involving bribery, threats, and rising desperation. The toddler would not look at the camera. The teenager radiated visible contempt for the matching sweater. The baby chose the crucial moment to melt down completely. The father's smile grew tighter and more homicidal with each failed attempt. And somewhere in the 45th minute, in a fleeting half-second of accidental cooperation, the shutter caught everyone looking approximately forward with approximately pleasant expressions, and that half-second became the truth, while the surrounding 44 minutes of chaos vanished, uncredited, just out of frame. The finished card told a story, and the story was a careful edit of the year. It said the family was happy, prosperous, and thriving. It said the children were delightful and well-behaved. It said the marriage was warm, the home was cosy, and the previous 12 months had unfolded as a gentle procession of joyful moments. It didn't say anything about the arguments, the financial strain, the child struggling in school, the quiet distance that had opened between the parents. The card was the year with all the difficulty removed, the highlight reel with no lowlights, a single glossy image standing in for 365 complicated days. Then came the exchange, the great national ritual of mutual performance. The cards went out to hundreds of recipients, and hundreds of other cards came back, each one carrying the same flawless, edited, sweater-clad message from another family conducting the same operation. You displayed the cards you received, taped to the doorframe or arranged on the mantel, a gallery of other people's perfect years, and you studied them, and you compared, and you felt inevitably that everyone else had managed a happiness that had somehow eluded you. Meanwhile, your card sat on their mantel, making them feel exactly the same way about you. The whole system was a closed loop of shared illusion, a collective agreement to show each other only the sweaters and never the arguments, and the agreement was so universal that it became nearly impossible to see through. Everyone knew on some level that their own card was a performance, a heavily edited fiction, assembled in 45 minutes of chaos. And yet everyone looked at everyone else's card and took it at face value, believing that these other families had achieved the effortless joy that they themselves were only pretending to have. The card was the perfect emblem of the whole suburban arrangement, a beautiful surface concealing a complicated reality, mailed out by the hundreds, believed by the recipients, forgotten by no one, the annual reassurance that everyone was happy, which is precisely what everyone needed to be told, and precisely what no one could quite believe about themselves. Behold the garage, that great cathedral of good intentions. Built to shelter 2 cars, it instead housed everything the family could not bear to part with and could not stand to look at. The treadmill nobody ran on, the holiday decorations for holidays that no longer felt festive, bins of clothes, tools, and mysterious cords that connected to nothing. Meanwhile, the actual cars sat outside in the driveway, exposed to the elements, because there was simply no room. The garage was a monument to consumption, a physical record of every impulse purchase, quietly overflowing while the family insisted they really would clean it out this spring. The irony was total and universal. The 2-car garage existed by definition to hold 2 cars. That was its entire purpose, the reason it had been built, the number literally in its name. And in household after household it held no cars at all, because the space intended for vehicles had been colonised, inch by inch, box by box, by the vast accumulation of stuff that the family had acquired and could not figure out what to do with. The cars, the very things the garage was designed to protect, had been evicted to the driveway, left out in the sun and the rain and the snow, while the garage devoted itself to sheltering possessions instead. The contents were an archaeology of the family's life, layered chronologically like sediment. Near the surface, the recent additions. Deeper in, the older strata, the things that had been there so long they had become invisible. Permanent fixtures nobody even saw anymore. There were the seasonal decorations, boxes of them, hauled out once a year and shoved back afterward. There were the tools, some useful, most dormant. There were bins of outgrown children's clothing kept for a someday that would never come. And everywhere, the cords, the mysterious tangle of cables and chargers and connectors that belonged to devices long discarded, saved on the theory that they might someday prove essential, which they never did. The treadmill deserved its own place of dishonour, because nearly every garage had one or its equivalent, the abandoned exercise equipment that stood as a monument to the person the buyer had briefly intended to become. Purchased in a burst of resolve, used with genuine enthusiasm for a week or two, and then quietly retired to the garage, where it became a very expensive shelf draped in coats and boxes, a daily reminder of good intentions gone slack. It could not be used, because using it would require excavating it. It could not be discarded, because discarding it would mean admitting defeat. So it stayed, gathering dust and laundry forever. The garage was, above all, a physical ledger of consumption, the accumulated evidence of a culture that bought constantly and released nothing. Every impulse purchase, every gadget that seemed essential in the store and useless at home, everything acquired to fill some momentary want, ended up here eventually, added to the pile. The suburb ran on buying, on the credit card and the mall and the keeping up with the Joneses, and the garage was where all that buying went to rest once the novelty wore off. It was the downstream reservoir of a lifestyle of acquisition, filling steadily, never draining, a growing monument to the gap between what the family had purchased and what the family actually needed. And presiding over all of it was the eternal promise, renewed each year and never kept, that this spring the garage would finally be cleaned out. This was the ritual incantation of the overstuffed garage, the reassuring lie the family told itself to make peace with the chaos. Come spring, they would sort it, purge it, organise it, reclaim the space for the cars. Spring came, spring went. The garage remained, fuller than the year before, the car still in the driveway, the treadmill still buried, the cords still tangled, the whole overflowing cathedral of good intentions waiting patiently for a reckoning that would never quite arrive, monument and warning both to a family that could not stop acquiring and could not bear to let go. As the decade wound down, a new dread crept into the beige comfort of suburbia, the year 2000. Word spread that at midnight on New Year's Eve, computers everywhere would misread the date, planes would fall, banks would fail, and civilization itself might blink out over a two-digit oversight. Suddenly, your neighbour was stockpiling canned goods and bottled water in that overflowing garage. People bought generators, people made plans. The same suburb that feared strangers and razor blades now feared the calendar. And then the clock struck 12, the light stayed on, and everyone quietly went back to worrying about the lawn. The root of the panic was, of all things, a technical shortcut. Long ago, to save precious computer memory, programmers had recorded years using only their last two digits, so that 1999 lived in the machines simply as 99. This had worked fine for decades. But as the year 2000 approached, a worry took hold. When the count rolled over, The computers might read the 2 zeros not as 2000 but as 1900, and in that confusion no one could quite say what the vast web of machines that ran modern life might do. The concern had a real basis. What happened next was the suburb doing what the suburb did best with a real basis for concern. It panicked magnificently. The predicted consequences grew more apocalyptic with each retelling, the gossip network doing its usual work of amplification. It started with reasonable worries about banking records and utility systems and escalated, mouth by mouth, into full civilizational collapse. The planes would fall from the sky, the banks would swallow everyone's savings, the power grid would fail, the water would stop, the traffic lights would go dark, and society itself, so dependent on its computers, would simply stop working at the stroke of midnight. It was the apocalypse, arriving not with fire or flood, but with a date formatting error, and the suburb, always primed for a good external threat, embraced it fully. The preparations were a sight to behold, and they went naturally into the garage. The neighbour who had spent years accumulating clutter now added a survivalist layer on top. Cases of bottled water, shelves of canned goods, stockpiles of supplies against the coming darkness. Generators were purchased and tested. Cash was withdrawn and hidden, on the theory that the banks might vanish. Some families made genuine plans for where they would go and how they would survive if the lights truly went out. The same households that had panicked over candy and strangers now channeled that familiar energy into preparing for the end of the world, and the preparations felt, as all the panics did, entirely reasonable at the time. The build-up reached a fever pitch as the final New Year's Eve approached, the whole culture holding its breath, uncertain whether it was throwing a party or attending a funeral for civilization. And then the clock struck midnight, and then, essentially, nothing happened. The date rolled over, the lights stayed on, the plane stayed up, the banks opened the next business day exactly as they always had. The vast feared catastrophe, the collapse of everything, simply failed to arrive, and the world woke up on the first morning of the new millennium to find itself entirely intact, faintly embarrassed, and sitting on a great deal of canned goods. The whole episode was the suburban relationship with fear in miniature, its entire pattern compressed into a single night. There was a real but manageable issue, inflated by rumour into an existential threat. There was the enthusiastic preparation for a disaster that spoke more to a hunger for drama than to any sober assessment of risk. There was the external, dramatic, and largely imaginary character of the threat, so much more compelling than the real and mundane dangers closer to home. And there was the anticlimax, the quiet return to normal, the canned goods migrating deeper into the garage to join the treadmill and the cords, and the swift redirection of all that anxious energy back to its usual target, the lawn, which still needed mowing, millennium or no millennium, world without end. So here you are at the end of the day, standing in your identical house, on your perfect lawn, behind your privacy fence, wondering why the American dream feels a little hollow around the edges. The 90s suburb was sold as the finish line, the reward for all that work, safety, space, and belonging. And it delivered on some of it. But it also delivered debt, isolation, quiet exhaustion, and the crushing full-time job of appearing fine. It was a beautiful set with a tired cast, all performing contentment for an audience of neighbours performing right back. The dream was real. It was just a lot heavier to hold than the brochure suggested. Consider what the dream had actually promised, because the promises were genuine and on their own terms appealing. Safety, a place to raise children away from the dangers of the crowded city. Space, a house of your own with a yard, room to breathe and grow. Belonging, a community of people like you, a neighbourhood to be part of. a sense of having arrived somewhere you were meant to be. These were not foolish things to want. They were among the most human things to want, and the suburb held them up as achievable, purchasable, waiting at the end of the road for anyone willing to work for them. And here is the fair part, the part that makes the whole story more than a simple indictment. The dream did deliver, at least in part. The children did grow up with yards to play in, and streets safer than many alternatives. The families did have space, real space, more room than most people in most times had ever known. There were good days, genuine ones, the summer barbecues that were actually fun, the neighbours who did become real friends, the quiet satisfaction of a home that was truly yours. It would be dishonest to pretend the suburb was nothing but a trap. For many it was a real and cherished life, and the good in it was as real as the rest. But the good came bundled with a price that the brochure never listed, and the price was steep. The debt that financed the whole performance, the credit cards and the mortgage and the endless keeping up, a financial weight carried quietly for decades, the isolation engineered into the very layout of the place, the garages and the fences and the waves that never became conversations, the exhaustion of the commute, the labour, the maintenance, the sheer effort of running the machine, and beneath all of it, the crushing, unrelenting, full-time job of appearing to be fine, of maintaining the surface, of keeping it all behind the door. That performance was perhaps the heaviest burden of all, because it was so total and so lonely. Everyone was doing it. Everyone stood on their perfect lawn projecting contentment, and everyone assumed the projected contentment of their neighbours was the real thing. It was a beautiful set populated by a tired cast, each actor performing happiness for an audience that was itself performing happiness right back. A hall of mirrors in which no one could ever be sure who was actually all right and who was only pretending. Because pretending was the one universal skill, mastered by all, admitted by none. So you stand here at the end of the day in the house that looks like every other house, on the lawn you have poured your Saturdays into, behind the fence that keeps the world politely at bay, and you feel it, the hollowness around the edges, the gap between what was promised and what arrived. The dream was real. That is what makes it complicated. It was not a lie exactly, just a partial truth sold as a complete one, a genuine set of comforts wrapped around a genuine set of costs, offered to millions of hopeful families who signed the papers and mowed the lawns and smiled for the cards and did their honest best to be happy inside it. Some of them were, many of them were some of the time, and all of them, on certain quiet evenings standing where you're standing now, felt the weight of a dream that turned out to be a great deal heavier to hold than anyone had ever thought to mention. So how was your stay in the suburbs? You woke up in a house that looked like every other house, mowed a lawn that ruled your life, and dodged a laser-printed letter from a homeowners association that measured your grass with a ruler. You kept up with the Joneses until the credit card statements piled up in a drawer nobody opened. You waved at neighbours you never really met, smiled for a Christmas card that took 45 minutes, and hid an entire year of trouble, and drove home along roads with no sidewalks to a garage too full of good intentions to hold a car. You performed contentment for an audience performing right back, and somewhere along the way, you got very, very good at appearing fine. And here is the thing worth remembering as you drift off. They were doing their best. The tired dad asleep in the recliner, the mother holding the whole performance together, the latchkey kid learning to be brave in an empty house, the neighbour throwing one more party to move one more box of inventory. They chased safety, space and belonging, and they paid for it in debt and distance and quiet exhaustion, and still, on the good days, they found the real thing. The barbecue that was actually fun, the friend who became family. The summer that felt, briefly, like the dream had come true after all. Because that is the strange, stubborn truth of it. People will always reach for a better life, even when the better life turns out to be heavier than the brochure promised. They will mow the lawn, smile for the card, and keep pretending, hoping the pretending eventually becomes real. So tonight, as you settle into your own bed, behind your own door, maybe let the performance rest for a while. You do not have to appear fine here, you can just be.